Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker for this evening. He has been a pilot for 32 years, including 24 years with the airlines, logging over 14,000 flight hours, earning 5 different type ratings. In addition, he has served as a 37th member of the National Transportation Safety Board, whereupon President Bush designated him vice chairman of the board for 2 years. He has also worked such NTSB cases as a U.S. Airways Flight 1549 and continues to be influential in the promotion of safety throughout the aviation industry. Please give a warm UND Aerospace welcome to the Honorable Robert L. Sumalt.
Thank you, Gerard. Good evening. Ni hao. It truly is a pleasure. It's a real honor to be here in Grand Forks tonight. I visited University of North Dakota in 2003, and I was very impressed with what I saw then. So when I was invited to come back, I was absolutely happy to accept the invitation. And thank you so much for having me tonight. I want to talk to you tonight about something that's very near and dear to my heart, and that's professionalism in aviation. But before we begin, I want to acknowledge that I did fly for a number of years, and I certainly recognize, as we've just seen from the beautiful awards that we've just have been given out, that for the most part, our aviation system operates with the highest degrees of professionalism. I want to acknowledge that right up front. But unfortunately, what we see at the NTSB so often is those cases that don't work out very well. So we'll look at a few of those, but again, for those of you who are operating professionally, thank you very much for what you're doing and keep it up. I thought that I would just start out for a few minutes and tell you a little bit about the NTSB. I think you know already who we are. The NTSB is an independent federal agency. We are charged by Congress to investigate transportation accidents, to determine their probable cause, and to issue safety recommendations to prevent the reoccurrence of those accidents. We are charged with investigating all civil aviation accidents in this country, but we also investigate selected rail accidents, selected highway accidents. We were the lead federal agency on the Minneapolis bridge collapse that occurred a few years ago. We investigate selected marine accidents and also selected highway accidents. There was selected pipeline accidents. There was a big pipeline accident out by the San Francisco airport back in September. It killed 9 people, wiped out an entire neighborhood, literally destroyed 35 houses. So that's what the NTSB does. We have a very broad mandate. The board, the actual board itself, is comprised of 5 presidentially nominated, Senate-confirmed board members. The President of the United States nominates us. We have to go and be confirmed by the U.S. Senate. And we have 5-year terms. So I've been at the board 4.5 years, so my term will expire at the end of this year. The board is there not to investigate the accidents. The actual 5-member board, we're not accident investigators. We have a professional staff that does that, and they do it very well. The board is there to provide the oversight over the staff's product, that after our investigative staff has completed the product, they then send it to the board for deliberation, and that's what the board primarily does. As I mentioned, we have a staff of about 400 very competent people. They are true professionals at what they do. We are headquartered in Washington, but we have 9 regional offices throughout the country. And a number of our investigators who are out in those regional offices, I think there are about 47 investigators in those regional offices. About half of those work from their own houses now. Because if you're going to investigate an accident, it doesn't matter if you leave from an office or from your house. So many of them do telecommute. And then we have a beautiful training center outside of Washington, out by Washington Dulles Airport. We hold a number of courses that the public can attend. And in that training center, we have the reconstructed wreckage of TWA 800. I was out there last week, and every time I see it, my heart stops. It is an incredible sight. to see. This is Erin Gormley. She's one of our investigators. She has a master's in aeronautical science. And I want to tell you, the NTSB, for a few years in a row, has been named one of the best places to work in the federal government. It is a wonderful agency. Our mission is very noble. We want to save lives, and that's a very important mission, and that's what we do. I'd like to tell you that, we have an aging workforce. I look around, and I'm not the youngest person working at the NTSB these days, and so we will need people to come in and work for the safety board in the years to come. So keep that in mind. It's a wonderful agency, and we need bright young people. Last May, we had a 3-day forum on the professionalism in aviation, and I think that indicated that the board was very concerned about some of the things that we've been seeing in aviation. And we had Mr. Lovelace from UND came and spoke, and he did a great job, and so we were glad to have him there. So I want to talk about professionalism, or maintaining the right attitude. And this attitude indicator is out of an airplane that crashed into Lake Michigan a few years ago and hit the ground in an attitude something like that. Let's look at that and how this might exemplify poor professionalism. The captain, this was a 135, a charter operation, the captain, who was also the chief pilot and the check airman, had a prior certificate revocation. He had routinely failed to comply with procedures and regulations. In fact, in a ground school, in a meeting of all of his pilots, he said that you're going to have to violate regulations from time to time. Just go ahead and get over it. And he also falsified training records. We know that there was a check ride that was signed off for the accident co-pilot, and it was a full check ride for Part 135, and yet when we went back and looked at the aircraft records, there was 0.2 of an hour recorded on the Hobbs meter. You can't give a complete check ride and a citation in 0.2 of an hour. They ended up losing control shortly after takeoff. There was a mechanical anomaly that the safety board, frankly, was not able to determine whether it was the autopilot might have been engaged right after takeoff, or maybe it was a runaway trim. We really could not determine which of those it was, but no matter which it was, the airplane was controllable if the crew had concentrating on flying the aircraft. But they didn't. They got so engrossed in trying to solve this problem that they literally lost control of the airplane. There were 6 fatalities. The NTSB found that the pilot's lack of discipline, their lack of in-depth systems knowledge, and adherence to procedures contributed to their inability to cope with the anomalies experienced during the accident flight. Not exactly what I would call professional behavior. And then there was this Hawker that crashed in Owatonna, Minnesota. The board just held a board meeting on this 3 weeks ago. The report was just published yesterday, so it's available on the web, as are all of these reports that we'll talk about. 8 fatalities here. Does anybody remember this accident? Yes. As you know, the aircraft touched down on the runway. They got down close to the end of the runway, to the departure end of the runway. They had about 1,200 feet remaining. They were at about 75 or 80 knots. The captain did not think they were going to stop on the runway, so he poured the coals to it, pushed the power up, didn't say anything to the first officer at all except for flaps, and they then attempted to take off again. They crashed. The aircraft ended up looking like this. The NTSB found that the captain allowed an atmosphere in the cockpit that did not comply with well-designed procedures intended to minimize operational errors, including the sterile cockpit adherence. What is sterile cockpit? What does that mean? Anybody know? No non-pertinent conversation. Thank you. no non-pertinent conversation in high workload periods of flight, including flight below 10,000 feet. They were talking about extraneous things, as unfortunately we see in so many accidents. They violated the sterile cockpit procedures, and this atmosphere permitted inadequate briefing of the approach and monitoring of the current wind conditions, weather conditions, inappropriate conversation, non-standard terminology, and a lack of checklist discipline throughout the descent and approach phases of flight. Again, not professional behavior. Now, I know everyone knows this one, the Colgan Air flight 2 years ago going into Buffalo. We all remember this flight. It was a de Havilland Dash 8, Dash 400, or a Q400. There were 50 fatalities, 49 in the airplane, 1 on the ground. Let's talk about what was going on here. I listened to the cockpit voice recorder, and I've read the report several times, including the transcripts from the cockpit voice recorder. I suspect many of you have read cockpit voice recorder transcripts over the years. And you know, when you read a cockpit voice recorder transcript, it usually just has like one line of text. Somebody says, hey, did you do this last night? Or how's everything going with your family? They're just short sentences. But in this accident, when you read the CVR transcript, there were blocks and blocks and blocks of text. And then listening to it, one of the things I said during the board meeting, and I still believe this, it was as if that flight was conducted simply so the captain could conduct a conversation with that young first officer. Just conversation about nothing, continuously engaged in conversation, not related to flight operations. And because they were engaged in all of this conversation, they got behind with doing critical things like the approach briefing, the descent checklist, and the approach checklist. And what happened is, because again, they're behind the airplane because of this conversation, the captain, they got about 3 miles from the outer marker, and the captain realized he was fast, so of course he pulled the power back, put the gear down, and pushed the props to max RPM. Now we know that when we pull the power back in a turboprop, that in itself is creating a lot of drag because the props are flattening out. When you put the gear down and then push the props forward, you've got a lot of drag on that airplane. And this airplane, it decelerated 50 knots in 21 seconds. For testing purposes, for certification purposes, we usually think in terms of an airplane slowing down at 1 knot per second. But this airplane was slowing down at 2.5 times that rate. I bet they were actually kind of hanging on the shoulder harnesses just a little bit. You know from flying glass cockpit airplanes that there's probably going to be a barber pole at the low speed to indicate whether the airplane is going to be too slow. And the top of that barber pole, at least on these airplanes, indicates the stall, the stick shaker, or the stall warning. So they slowed down, they got the stall warning at 131 knots. When that happens, when you get the stall warning, the autopilot disconnects. The board said that the captain reacted with startle and confusion. And how do we recover from a stall? Unload the aircraft, don't you? Well, in this case, the nose was already at about 9 degrees pitch. That should have been an indication that you're slow. They're at 9 degrees pitch. They get the stick shaker. The captain reacted with startle and confusion and then pulled the nose from 9 degrees up to 19 degrees in a 1 second period of time. Of course, the airplane stalled. They went from a stall warning to an actual stall. They got an extreme roll to the left, to the right, to the left, and to the right. And then the stick pusher fired 3 times. Each time the stick pusher is screaming, unload, push the stick forward. That's what the stick pusher is trying to say. And each time the captain pulled against the stick pusher and exacerbated the stall. And of course, They lost control. I'm going to show you a video right now. There's no audio associated with this. I'll show you the NTSB's recreation of this accident. I'll show you two animations tonight. Both of these are available from the NTSB's website. So let's go ahead and look at this one. So we will have, of course, you'll be able to see the flaps. At the time of the upset, the flaps had been at 5 degrees, and the upset occurred as the flaps were in transit to 15 degrees. The upset occurred right as they're transiting through about 10 degrees. This, of course, is the condition levers for the props. So the props were at their max RPM. The power was at flight idle. You can see, it might be a little hard to see here tonight with the lighting, but there's a shadow. When the control wheel is pulled back, you can almost see the shadow of it to see that it's pulled back. Watch this. Here's the top of the barber pole that I was telling you about, and that's the point of the stick shaker activation. Here's the speed. It will turn red anytime that they're below the red barber pole here. Stick shaker off or on, or pusher off or on. They were about 1,500 feet above ground when the upset occurred. So the field elevation's about, 780 feet. You'll see what's being said on the cockpit voice recorder here. And let's go ahead and watch it. Flaps 5. So they go to 15. Now they're cleared for the approach. Notice the power's back pretty far. Speed's at about 180 knots right now. Okay, he acknowledges that the approach is armed on the autopilot. Gear down, floats alive. Colgan contact tower, good night. Okay, there go the condition levers going to full forward. Speed's dropping. The gear's now down, dropping pretty good. Flaps 15 before landing checklist. Here it comes. Here it comes right now. There's the upset. And that was it. There's a lot to look at on that video, and every time I watch it, I see something else. So again, you can go and download it, but one thing that I look at now is the position of the control wheel, and you can see that that wheel is held all the way back. And this little house in Buffalo ended up looking like this. The investigation looked at a number of issues, and the one that I want to talk about tonight is the issue as it relates to cockpit discipline. The NTSB found that the captain's failure to effectively manage the flight enabled conversation that delayed checklist completion and conflicted with sterile cockpit procedures. There again, that sterile cockpit procedure, and it created an atmosphere, created an environment that impeded timely error detection. You know, as a friend of mine who's still flying for the airline says, is that the sterile cockpit, yeah, it might be a federal aviation regulation, but it's more than that. For my friend who's still flying, he says it's a procedure that I use to help keep me out of trouble. So yes, it may be not required in a flight training environment, and it may not be required in a Part 91 environment, but it is a darn good procedure, a good layer of defense to keep you out of trouble. Here's another one. This was one of the first accidents that that came to the board when I was a new board member. You may remember this one. This was the Pinnacle Airlines repositioning flight in Jefferson City back in 2004. Just two pilots. They were positioning the airplane, I think, from Little Rock to Minneapolis, St. Paul. And what the investigation discovered is that right after takeoff, they, I think, wanted to just play with the airplane and see what she would do. So right after takeoff, they over-rotated it such that they got the stick pusher right after takeoff. Imagine being just in the air and having the stick pusher fire and jerking the control wheel all the way forward. But that's what they did. That would get your attention. So they intentionally over-rotated the airplane, which caused the stall warning to activate right after takeoff, against Pinnacle policy. They swapped seats after they got in the air. As they were climbing through 15,000 feet, they decided to see what these little pedals on the floor are for. So they started horsing around with the rudder pedals, sloshing the tail back and forth. And they came within about a tenth of the same lateral G's that knocked the tail off of American 587 up at Kennedy just a few years earlier. They almost knocked the tail off of the airplane. They decided to climb to flight level 410. Why? Well, they didn't have anybody on board. They thought they would just go up there. A controller said, verify the type of an airplane that you are. And he said, well, we're a Canadair regional jet. And the controller said, yeah, I was wondering, I've never seen one of those airplanes up at flight level 410 before. And the pilot replied, well, we didn't have any passengers on board, so we decided we'd come up here, quote, to have a little fun. Well, the airplane wasn't climbing like they wanted it to as they were going through 37,000 feet. They said, we want to make it climb faster. So they reached over to the autopilot and put it in a vertical speed mode and selected 500 feet per minute. It was only climbing at about 200 feet per minute. It was giving them all it could, but they wanted more, so they selected 500 foot per minute rate of climb. So what are they doing? They're trading what for what? Airspeed for altitude. And by the time they reached flight level 410, they were literally behind the power curve. They were 50 knots below the recommended climb speed by the time they leveled off at flight level 410. The captain gets up out of the seat. He goes back for a drink, a soda, and he says, hey, you want a drink? And somebody said, yeah, grab me a beer. Of course, they're just laughing. It was funny, but I didn't laugh when I heard it on the cockpit voice recorder. The captain comes back in. He looks, and he says, wow, we're really slow. So he requests lower. They need lower. And of course, what does ATC say? Stand by. Well, let me tell you, aerodynamics, lift, drag, thrust, and weight don't understand stand by. And the airplane stalled. And again, just like we saw before, mishandled the stick pusher. The stick pusher fired a few times, and each time it did, the captain yanked back on the wheel, and we started an oscillation, 10 degrees down, 10 degrees up, 20 down, 20 up, 30 down, 30 up. Both engines quit. They did not get them restarted. In fact, the engines were so severely damaged, they may not have started. They did get it under control. They recovered from the upset at about 33,000 feet. And then they told ATC, we have lost an engine. not both engines. We have lost an engine. And, you know, if you're at 33,000 feet, you could probably glide about 70 or 80 or 90 miles. But they weren't truthful with ATC. Now they're flying over airports that could have given them some alternatives, and they kept flying past those. Finally, they got down to about 13,000 feet. The APU would not start. They're at 10,000 feet now. They've literally run out of airspeed and ideas. They've run out of altitude and ideas at the same time. Now they tell ATC, we've got a problem. We're declaring an emergency. And they tried to glide into an airport, and they landed about 3 miles short of the airport. NTSB determined the probable cause was the pilot's unprofessional behavior, their deviations from standard operating procedure, their poor airmanship, which resulted in an in-flight emergency from which they were unable to recover. A few months after that one, there's this airplane here. Nice-looking Challenger, but it doesn't look real good stuck in the side of that building right there. Airplane, the pilots did not perform a weight and balance. The airplane was too far forward on the CG. They couldn't rotate, so the captain made the decision to reject the takeoff, a high-speed reject. We didn't think that was necessarily unreasonable under the circumstances, but nevertheless, they did not conduct a weight and balance. We basically say that the failure to conduct the weight and balance was symptomatic of poor airmanship and a broader pattern of deficiency in their crew resource management skills, specifically leadership, workload management, communications, and all of those kinds of things. There was a midair collision over the Hudson River in August of '09, 9 fatalities. This one, like all the rest, will make you sick. I'll show you an animation in just a minute. The air traffic controller, right after this airplane, the Cherokee, the Saratoga, right after he took off, the controller got on a personal phone call. Now, I've heard the full tape. You won't hear the full tape, but you will know that this person's on a personal phone call. He's talking to a woman. It's a very flirtatious sort of a call. They're talking about a cat that had gotten killed on the runway. And this woman worked in airport operations, and so she had to go out and clean up the dead cat. So the first thing he says when he calls her is, fire up the grill, we're going to cook this cat. And the conversation was basically very flirtatious between the two of them. Meanwhile, this Cherokee, 71 Mike Charlie, reads back a frequency change from this controller incorrectly. But because the controller is having a chit-chat with this gal down in operations, he doesn't catch the erroneous readback. He doesn't catch and correct the readback. So this airplane is stuck down low in this Class B exclusion area, which is where the helicopters tend to fly. If he would have caught and corrected the readback, he could have put the airplane on the right frequency, which would have then climbed this Cherokee, the Saratoga, up out of harm's way. But he didn't. And we did determine that the air traffic controller's behavior contributed to this accident because he didn't detect and correct the readback. So let's listen to this. This is about a 5-minute video, but it'll make you sick because you'll see these two targets merging, and 5 seconds before the end of the phone call, 5 seconds before the collision of these two aircraft, the phone call ends. He's sitting there chatting while these two aircraft are coming together. And he finally hangs up and says, let me straighten this mess out, because he realizes that this guy's, as he's going to say, he's lost in the hurts, as he's going to say. Let's watch the video. This aircraft is coming off of Teterboro.
Lance 1 Mike Charlie, radar contact, the altitude.
1 Mike Charlie, climbing out of 400.
Lance 1 Mike Charlie, roger, traffic 11 o'clock and 2 miles, northwestbound 1000, helicopter.
1 Mike Charlie, looking. 9 seconds up to down and make your visual.
Helicopter 9 seconds up, thank you. Lance 1 Mike Charlie, helicopter has you inside.
Thank you, sir.
The 9 cities coming up on Georgia.
Look up the 9 Tango Delta taxiway, Juliet, clear 2 lane.
Hold on, Juliet, 92.
Okay, fire up the grill. So, for the entire time that this is on, he's on this phone call. Here's his traffic. In just a moment, we'll see a blue target coming off, which is the helicopter.
On my Charlie, start a left turn to join the Hudson River.
Left Mike Charlie.
One Mike Charlie, of course, is the accident airplane.
Charlie, tower, that runway 19 cross. I'll tell you what, cross 19 at Quebec. And taxi to 19.
Full taxi to 19, cross 19.
Damn. That's where my Charlie contact Newark Tower 127.
Charlie, report him on a 227 plane.
Okay.
Second Newark. I did. Keep an eye on him, though. One Mike Charlie, Newark 2785. He's lost in the Hertz. Land 71 Mike Charlie, City Tower.
Still on the call. Look at this. Still on the call. Phone call ends. Crash. Not professional behavior. It's sickening. Yes, the NTSB did determine that the primary part of the probable cause was the inherent limitations of see and avoid. The helicopter could not really be seen until about a second before the collision because it blended in with the landscape of downtown Manhattan. But the second part of the probable cause was the controller's performance. This is one that I did not deliberate. This occurred before. This went to the board before I joined the board, but this was a CFED accident involving a commuter airline, 13 fatalities. Basically, they were on a non-precision approach. This would have been the glide path, a typical glide path towards the runway, and this is what they did, and they ran into the ground. They were talking about all kinds of things below 10,000 feet. NTSB, a finding was the pilot's non-essential flight below 10,000 feet, again, not following the sterile cockpit procedures, reflected a demeanor and cockpit environment that fostered deviation from established standard procedures, from crew resource management disciplines, division of duties, and professionalism, which reduced the margins of safety well below acceptable limits. Again, not professional behavior. Comair accident at Lexington. This was the very first accident that I went to. I started at the NTSB 7 days before this accident. So I went to the accident. It was my training accident, if you will, so I could learn how to be a board member at an accident. I think we know this was a wrong runway departure attempt, 49 fatalities. The airplane was cleared to taxi to this runway, runway 22. Instead, the crew taxied to this one. This is nighttime. This is before sunrise. It's early morning departure. It's dark. They taxied to this runway, which has no what? Has no lights. And they attempted to take off, and they ended up here. So let's talk about this. They're going to taxi from about here. They stopped at the whole short line here and then turned onto that runway and started a takeoff roll. So I want to talk about the captain's tone that was established during the pre-flight. As an airline pilot, when I listened to the CVR, I think I picked up on these things. First of all, about 7 minutes before engine start, the captain, these guys had never flown before. They ended up in the cockpit. First, they showed up at the airport and tried to get on. They got on the wrong airplane and started the APU, and they started out their day wrong, and it got worse from there. But I think the captain was trying to set a very easygoing tone. And one of the things he said, and I picked up on this, sort of a fake Southern accent. Now, nobody can speak a Southern accent better than I can. But this guy was not from the South. And he says, "I'm easy, buddy." He kind of reminded me that he's trying to be a real Bubba and real easygoing, and let's just have a good time today. And then he said that he's briefing the first officer. He says, "Run the checklist at your leisure." Now, we learned from Northwest 255 at Detroit back in 1987 that you don't run the checklist at your leisure. You run the checklist at the designated time when it's called for by the designated pilot, and you do it precisely. But here's somebody that he's trying to be easy, buddy, and he says, run the checklist at your leisure. And so I think that this statement by the captain started sending a very subtle but very powerful message to the first officer that the captain's procedural compliance and discipline would be leisurely. And then a few minutes later, he says, before starting, at your leisure. He's calling for the before start checklist. Before starting, at your leisure. And then he says about a minute later, start the engines at your leisure. And then he says, he's talking about the ground crew saying it's okay to start. He says it's okay to turn one at your leisure. Now, folks, this is the fourth time in 3.5 minutes that this captain has used this phrase, at your leisure. And the message now is becoming less subtle. And the first officer is probably starting to interpret this, that, you know what, this is going to be an easy trip. This guy's easy, buddy, and we can just have a good old time today. You can do whatever you like. Let's just have fun. Now, while they're starting these engines, I don't know what an engine costs on a CRJ these days. It's probably $1.5 million or $2 million. I don't know, maybe more. They're starting these engines, and you probably ought to be watching the parameters to make sure you're not going to torch these engines. But they're just talking for 2 minutes while they're starting engines, talking about things not related to the flight. And it's like, we've done this so many times, we can do this in our sleep. At some point, the captain says, finish it up at your leisure. Finish up the checklist at your leisure. This is the 5th time he's used that term. Now the first officer's feeling really good. I mean, this is going to be a very casual, relaxed flight. And so they don't comply with the sterile cockpit procedures. And what I believe is that I would always start out a trip. I tried to always be by the book, but I wanted to make sure that I was even more so at the beginning of the trip, because I know by the end of the 4th day of a trip, you're going to be tired, and it's going to kind of go downhill a little bit from there. So you've got to have the very high standards at the very beginning of the trip, because it'll just start to creep down a little bit if you don't. I mean, even if you do try to maintain a high standard. So why start out with a low bar to begin with? So I think the captain had sent such a message that the first officer, he felt perfectly comfortable while they're taxiing out, initiating a conversation not related to the safety of that flight. And in fact, 40 of the 150 seconds during the taxi out were in violation of the sterile cockpit. So now the airplane is now holding short, and by the way, this is the approximate period of the non-pertinent conversation, which I believe was key, and the board believes this was key to their positional disorientation. They get to this whole line, and guess what the first officer says when he calls the tower? Tower, Comair 51, at your leisure, is ready for takeoff. Now, how many times have you ever called the tower and said, at your leisure, we're ready to go? But it just proves to me that this at your leisure attitude transcended from the left seat to the right seat, and now they are so leisurely and they take off on the wrong runway. And here's what the NTSB had to say about that. The flight crew's non-compliance with standard operating procedures, including the captain's abbreviated taxi briefing and both pilots' non-pertinent conversation, most likely created an atmosphere in the cockpit that enabled the crew's errors. One of my mentors is a guy by the name of John Lauber. John Lauber served on the NTSB for 10 years back in the 80s and 90s. And one thing that John wrote, he said, there's a fine line separating a relaxed and easy atmosphere in a cockpit from a lax one where distractions can result in critical failures. And he says professionalism may be described as knowing the difference between the two. I can tell you it is heart-wrenching to go into the cockpit voice recorder lab, put those headphones on, and listen to a crew engaging in a leisurely, fun, jovial, relaxed, laughing, joking conversation. And I know how that flight's going to end, but it's even worse to go to an NTSB board meeting where I know that sitting right there in the front of the boardroom is the family of the pilots that we're talking about. After this Comair accident, the Comair captain's wife was literally seated in the front row of our boardroom. And during one of the breaks, one of my colleagues walked by and she accosted him for saying such bad things about her husband. We're just calling it the way that we see it. We're not speaking bad about anybody. We're just saying what happened in the accident. Just 3 weeks ago when we had the Owatonna accident, the then fiance of the first officer was there, and every time we said something, I looked at her and saw how she cringed as she came to the boardroom. Yesterday we had a family assistance conference at the NTSB, and at the end of the conference, one of the family members from the Colgan Air accident stood up and they talked about how when they read that cockpit voice recorder transcript, how it angered them to know the casual attitude that was going on in that cockpit because they lost their son. I hear stories like this over and over. I think some people think, well, this is my airplane. But if you're flying for an air carrier, it's not your airplane. You owe it to the people that are paying your salaries to fly professionally. And we have seen way too many cases. This is just some of them, but because I didn't think you wanted to be here all night long, I'm not showing you all of them. Some of you, in a few years, will be seated right here in the left seat of an airliner. Maybe it'll be a King Air. Maybe it'll be something else. Maybe it'll be a CRJ. How are you going to run that cockpit? So I've decided to come up with a few tips to avoid something that looks like this. These are tips that I'm drawing on my background in flying airplanes for a living, and also tips that I'm drawing on my experience as an NTSB board member for the last 4.5 years. I think these tips will keep you out of trouble. You take the letters NTSB, and usually that stands for National Transportation Safety Board, but tonight and hopefully for the rest of your career, you will remember these things as it relates to the letters NTSB. The N stands for negative publicity avoidance. Avoid negative publicity, okay? This flight crashed in Charlotte, North Carolina. My brother-in-law was a passenger on board this airplane. There were 37 fatalities out of the 57 occupants. The captain survived. The captain later said, you never know on which flight your career will be judged. And you can be the ace of the base. You can be the best pilot ever. You can win aerobatic championships. You can graduate top in your class. But if you go out and crash an airplane, people aren't going to remember you for those things. You don't want your name here. You know, if you go out and have an accident, I kind of know what the NTSB is going to say, but NTSB doesn't really matter. What really matters is, what are your friends going to say? What are your neighbors going to think when they walk outside and that quiet little street that you used to live on looks like this? And finally, and most importantly, what's your family going to think? I think sometimes people forget that when they leave behind a real mess. And I see it all the time. The T is based on when you've got a decision to make, take the conservative approach. I was very fortunate in my airline career. I was a captain for a major airline at 27 years old. I was lucky. But let me ask you something. How much can you know when you're at 27 years old? Fortunately, yeah, I made mistakes. But one rule that has guided me all the way through all of that was this one rule here. If you have to make a decision, take the conservative approach. You know, do you want to de-ice or not de-ice? We got a little frost on the wings. Should we de-ice? Oh, I don't know, maybe we should. If you've got to make a decision, just go ahead and de-ice the airplane. Nobody's really going to criticize you for making the conservative choice there, but they will criticize you if you make the wrong choice and you crash. Trying to decide whether I should divert or continue. Well, if you're worried about it, divert. Should you add more fuel or risk a min-fuel landing? Should I delay my departure because of the weather or go? If you're faced with a decision like this, err on the conservative side. Take the most conservative approach. The S. This S stands for Standard Operating Procedures, adhering to Standard Operating Procedures. This is an old Boeing chart that came out in 1993. In fact, one of the guys that put this together is now a colleague of mine. He's on the NTSB, Earl Weiner. But what this says is accident cause factors. They looked at hull losses of Boeing airplanes over a 10-year period. The first and the third cause of accidents, primary cause factors, the first cause is pilots not adhering to procedures, the pilot flying not adhering to procedures. And the third causal factor is the non-flying pilot not adhering to procedures. That ought to tell you something right there, that once you start deviating from procedures, you're setting yourself up for an accident, more so than if you just follow the procedures. We have data from LOSA. Do you know LOSA, Line Operations Safety Audit? The data from looking at over 6,000 observations of line flights, of air carrier flights, tells us that the crews who intentionally deviate from standard operating procedures are about 3 times more likely to commit another error that has consequential results. Let's face it, we all make errors. The errors that we really want to guard against are those that have consequential results. So once you start deviating from those SOPs, you are 3 times more likely to commit another error that has consequential results. And then there's the normalization of deviance. Does anybody know that term there? We start deviating from the procedures, and we normalize that. We get so used to deviating, that's the new normal. And there's a danger there because there's a slippery slope. You've forgotten that this is where the procedures were. Now you're so used to doing it this way. And the B stands for be professional. What is professionalism? Well, it's a mindset. Precise checklist usage, precise call-outs, precise compliance with the procedures and the regulations, keeping up with what's going on. If you don't know the answer to something, say you don't know it. I think if I had to sum it up, I'd say that professionalism is doing the right things even when no one is watching. There was an article in Business and Commercial Aviation last month. Dick Ahrens in his Cause and Circumstance article. He says, flying like a pro first means understanding one's personal limitations and those of the aircraft being flown. It means understanding maneuvers and procedures. It means taking seriously the task of piloting an aircraft, big or small. That doesn't mean you can't have fun doing it. Flying an airplane safely and professionally is fun. Indeed, the fun should be found in meeting the challenges of the profession. So, next time you see the letters NTSB, think of those things we talked about tonight. Negative publicity avoidance. Take the most conservative approach. Standard operating procedures. Follow them. And finally, be professional. And if you remember and follow those things, I think it will help you from seeing the NTSB meaning something like this. I want to thank you for your attention. It's great to be here. Thank you very much. Thank you. I want to thank you for that warm welcome. I know that you have to go back and study, so I don't want to keep you. Dana's indicated that we might have a few minutes for questions. We'll take, if there are questions, we'll take 2 or 3, 4 questions. Any questions? Is anybody still there? Okay, well, I'll be around if you have any questions, and again, I'm so glad to be here. Thank you. Keep up the good work. Oh, good. I was hoping for a question. Yeah, thanks.
How come the findings from the NTSB aren't admissible in court?
I couldn't hear that. There's a microphone roving somewhere around here. How come the findings from the NTSB aren't something?
Aren't admissible in a court?
Because the law prevents it. The federal law, the statute written when the NTSB was founded in 1967. Actually, it goes back to 1930 when the Civil Aeronautics Board, or 32 when the CAB was founded. But in the wisdom of the Congress, they did not want our findings, our analysis cannot be entered into a court of law. We don't want our investigators spending 90% of their time in court testifying. Our purpose in life is to investigate the accident so that we can prevent the accidents. That's our entire purpose. We don't want to get embroiled in trying to figure out what is the litigation aspects of this. We just want to be pure and cite those findings, and that's it. And that's not unusual. If you have an automobile accident, you can't, in a court of law, go out and take the police report and enter that and say, see, this person ran the red light, so therefore my client gets $100 million. You have to prove your case, and it's the same thing here. The factual portion of our investigations can be entered into a court of law because the facts are the facts. You can't then sit there and read the accident report and say, here's what the NTSB found. You have to get your own experts to then show that to the jury. So I hope that answers your question. Any other questions? Okay. Well, good. I'll be around. Again, thank you very much. Safe flying. Thank you.